we move into this period of transition. Thank you all for being here. I'm looking also to see, I wanted to let everybody on Zoom know that if you have questions and points you would like Mike to clarify, I'll be watching for you on Zoom. And Mike, the microphone is yours.
Well, good morning again. So here we are. This is one of those moments within the life of the church that is normal and regular. And it's also one of those moments where there's sometimes a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of excitement, sometimes some joy for the person who's going on to another stage of their life, and also some mourning that they're not going to be present among you in the same way that they once were. So before I really talk more about the process itself, I just want to talk about some of the things that you might be feeling and say that it's all okay. Every single bit of it, it's fine. It's okay. It should be. At these times, whenever there's a goodbye, hello, tend to be times of mixed feelings. And so, again, whatever you're feeling, there's really not a wrong feeling to be able to have during this time. And I just want to clarify that for you and just make it really clear that whatever you're feeling, it's normal, and it's been felt in other situations of other people at the same moment, at the same time. And recognize it and listen to it and figure out what information that it's sharing for you. One of the things that happens a lot for a lot of people is that every time of a moment or change, there's some sense of grief that is cumulative. And so you might find yourself looking back at some of those other moments or feeling some of that other grief from other moments and other times too. And again, that's normal. Turn to each other, turn to one another, let each other know that you might need a help through the day or an extra prayer. It's okay. I do want to talk more about some of the process stuff. And this is some of the pieces that might be wonky at moments and at times. And if I use a term that you are unfamiliar with, feel free to just go ahead and throw up your hand because once you've been doing anything long enough, the wonk slips in. So I'll do my best. And if there's a term that I use that you don't know, please just throw your hand and yell out your question around that term, and I'll do the best I can to catch you up. So within the United Church of Christ, the way pastoral transition works is different than some other denominations that maybe you've been a part of before. Within some denominations where you have somebody who's called a bishop, they might say, hey, you pastor over there, and you church over there, you all get together and figure things out and have ministry together. That's sort of one version of it. The other way is within even more independent churches than the United Church of Christ, a church is completely on their own to figure out how to find a pastor. There might be some sort of network of relationships where you put out word that there's a pastorate vacancy is open and try to find somebody, interview with someone through that process. But that's not quite where we are either. We're really somewhere in between. Whereas the one with no support is really sort of your own separate small nonprofit, and you're really on this on your own. And where the one with the bishop piece is kind of more like a matchmaking service, we're sort of a little bit more like a dating service. All right? So what that'll mean is that the local church puts together something called the local church profile. Where you talk about who you are, who you might be called to become, and the person that you think might be a match for you. At the same time, pastors put together something called a pastor's profile, where they talk about who they are, the kind of ministry that they're called to, and the kind of ministries that they're called to serve. What the United Church of Christ does, as part of what we offer, is essentially help you find each other. Everybody who puts together a pastor's profile, it has to go through a criminal background check, and those are part of a database. The local churches, there'll be a time we'll all have to sort of check off your profile as a local church and say, to the best of my knowledge, this profile is accurate and true. And that is also then put into something called UCC ministry opportunities, which is essentially our classifieds, where pastors look for matches. Then there's 3 different primary ways that you find each other within the official system that we offer. The first and most common is that a pastor will request that their pastor's profile, is sent to a local church. And the local church will, and you'll be hearing more about this later, has something called a search committee. It's a small committee of folks within the church. Usually what I recommend is some of the wisest people in the church who take a look at those profiles and try to figure out who among the profiles that they receive might be the best match for their congregation. The other way that you can receive a profile is that we have people who, because of an area or family relationships they have, are interested more in an area. So we'll receive profiles on a fairly regular basis of people who are interested in serving within the Pacific Northwest Conference. I have a role in that to sort of help winnow those down, not to limit you from seeing them, but if someone says, for example, that they're particularly interested in chaplaincy, or that they're particularly interested in very small rural church settings, or if they're particularly interested in the suburban settings, unless there's other things within that profile that looks like it might be a match with what you're looking for, I won't send those your way. Otherwise, what I look for is what I call subjectively a 40% match between what I see in the pastor's profile and what I have heard in the local church profile and heard from the church, and let you and the Holy Spirit figure out the other 60%. It's really just to try to help save the search committee a little bit of work. The third way, and it's the rarest, is that sometimes a local church will request the profile of a pastor. So let's say that your search committee is aware of Sharon Smith, who serves St. John's by the gas station, and they've heard that they're a great pastor and think that they'll be a great match for your church. Your search committee can request to see that person's profile. That request comes to me. I call up the pastor and said, hey, we have a church that would be interested in talking with you. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Are you interested in having a conversation with them? The vast majority of the time, they hear, the reason that they're hearing good things about this person is because they're really happy where they are and they have no desire to move. But once in a while, someone's like, I was just thinking that maybe it's time to start looking for something different. And so once in a while, you find that match that way. Now those are the things that the United Church of Christ offers. Sometimes search committees will make the decision to put the word out in different ways through magazines such as the Christian Century or Sojourners or something along that line, or to reach out to seminaries to find people who are coming right out of seminary, all those sorts of things. And because we're the UCC, those are things that you can do. We offer a service, and our service has limitations. There are other things that you can do to look for and find more candidates and help, in most cases, point people towards the services we have, but occasionally there might be other things that we can talk about. Part of my job will be that when you decide to do one of those things, is just to let you know the upsides and the downsides of what I've seen of other churches who have used similar systems. I really don't know how many searches that I have done with churches, but it's well over 200 now, between this position and my previous position, so I've got some data. And so my task is to really share that data with search committees, because ultimately, my most selfish goal is to have the search work out so darn well that the only reason I get called back is for celebrations, all right? That's part of the goal, and I want you to be able to have that celebration and that ongoing celebration with the person too. Now, most immediately, that's sort of the big picture of the search process. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the transitional time, but I wanted to see if there's any questions about the bigger picture of the process too, either online or among folks who are gathered here today. Not on Zoom? Okay. All right, great. There'll be another time that I'll talk about this, and I'll do some specific training, if requested, with the board and with the search committee about more of the details around this stuff too. So during the transitional time, when I first started working here, the if a church was moving into a transition, we basically had one recommendation, and that recommendation was to get an interim minister. That was the sole transitional ministry person we had. Interim ministers are very important and very good. If you were to sort of compare them to something else, they're kind of like a post-relationship therapist for a congregation, all right? This is not going to be the person that you're going to begin a new relationship with. In fact, there's a non-candidacy clause for someone who is an interim. But what they do is they say, okay, in this previous relationship with a pastor, this was who you were. These were some of the things that you learned about yourself. This was why this worked. This was some of the ways that it didn't work for you. And then they say, this is who you are now. This is who you say you want to be. They hold up a mirror to the congregation. Based on that, who might be the person that might be the right match for you? What are some things that might be worked out best during this time when the I is the, and it's not me, this is the interim, it's somebody else, but while the interim is there, that it could be done and help smooth the way for the incoming pastor too. What are some of those issues, either systemic stuff or it's a wide variety of things that might be part of a congregation's life. What are some of those things that might need to be worked through? So interim ministry was something relatively new within the U.S. church. It really came in the early 90s from the Presbyterians in a more official way, and then the United Church of Christ adopted it and said, this is the thing. And the main reason for it was that there was this recognition that in a lot of cases, if a church had some challenges that were not addressed, significant challenges that were not addressed, the person who followed the longer-term pastor tended to be a short-term pastor anyway, because conflict would arise, because the church either sort of in the immediacy tried to get somebody exactly like the previous pastor or exactly different than the previous pastor, and they hadn't had enough time to have a responsive call as opposed to a reactive call. And so the idea of an interim was someone who could help the congregation sort of through that reflection and go through more of a process. And interims have been very good and very important. And we have found that they're not necessarily appropriate for every single situation. There's the more general category of transitional ministry that interim ministry is part of, but we no longer say interim ministry is the only way to go. There's other folks that might be more specific transitional pastors based on the needs that a congregation has or a congregation wants to work through. That it might not specifically be the interim minister that helps them through that. So for example, we had one transitional pastor in one place where essentially their whole administrative system, their whole constitution and bylaws, their entire structure, the congregation really recognized all of that needed to be changed. And they'd gotten to that because they'd already had a lot of conversation. They already worked with some other consultants while the other pastor was there. They already had some momentum going in that direction. So they brought in somebody to really help them with some more of the sort of the administrative structural pieces. That person also did some pastoral care piece, but they didn't necessarily do the reflective piece in the same sort of way that an interim would have done, because the congregation had already done a lot of that reflective work over the last several years. So in that case, you have somebody who has specific skills. There's also another term called designated that we've been using more and more within the United Church of Christ. That really falls in a couple different categories. One is where the church has already done a lot of significant work about their mission and their vision. They're already at a place of momentum, and they think that it's likely that if they bring in someone to do other kind of transitional work like an interim, that they might lose some of that good momentum and that good energy. So the idea of a designated pastor in that case is somebody that you bring in for a limited amount of time initially by contract, usually somewhere around a year and a half to a year. Then at that end of that contract time, you decide either to call the person as the settled pastor, or at the end of that time to basically say, we've learned more during this time period and recognize that we need something different and move into a fuller search process. So that's something else that happens. Other times it's because a church has thinks they have a pretty clear call around what they're called to be, but also have some significant uncertainty about what they are called to be. And it's just more honest to be able to say, this is who we are 70% sure we are, but 30% is still up to question. And so we'd like to invite you to be with us, thinking that we're going in this direction that we've worked on, that we've found and we've discovered. And again, sort of have a time for evaluation around whether that person and this church are a match once they move through that work and through that process together. Because sometimes a transition that people think will take 10 years ends up taking a year. And at the end of that time period, they're a different church and they're moving in a direction and they need something with different skills. And so the idea with a designated is that at the end of that time period, if either the person who is called as the designated pastor or the church decides that this is no longer moving forward, it's kind of a no harm, no foul movement, and people move on because it's understood from the beginning with consent from all parties that it might move in that direction. Another model of ministry that is sometimes mixed in with some of these other pieces that is newer to us but not newer to a lot of churches, particularly within the African American church, is a succession model. With a succession model, there's usually the sense that there already is a pretty clear vision and direction that the church has around a lot of things. And in order to give an incoming pastor the time to get some momentum with that direction, as well as it being maybe a complicated enough situation as far as some of the relationships that might be in the wider community within that church, someone is called to overlap with the person who is the current pastor, with the understanding that when the current pastor leaves, the person will become the pastor of the congregation, the sole pastor or lead pastor of the congregation. This is not a model that we've used a lot, but it's a model that's growing in use within the United Church of Christ, and one that is worth your consideration as you look at all the work that you've done. It's ultimately your decision, of course, to figure out which one of these is the best, and I don't recommend one of these higher than another generally, but I would say that this new model is also one that would be important to include in all of your options. And in some ways, other churches, it would not be one of those options that would be a good option for them to have included within their mix. But I think at least for your discernment, it's worth having that as part of the mix. So I'm going to check to see if there's any other questions about that, either online or among you, because that's a whole other piece about the transition part itself. Yeah. Yeah, can you get that microphone? Thank you very much.
I have a question about the succession model. Now, is that pastor called when they come on board? Are they called later? Is it a contract situation? What happens with that succession model?
Yeah, different churches have done that different ways. So there's some that really have the clear understanding that this person is called as another settled pastor and becomes the lead pastor when the current pastor's term or time of overlap comes to an end. There are some other churches that are, because the designated model is also a newer model from us, are combining those two and say that within the succession model, that person is a designated call, and at the end of that time, they'll make the determination. There's not tons of experience with the overlap of the two. That doesn't mean that those churches are wrong. It just might mean that they're early.
So, Mike, in one or two words then, interims, designated, transitional,
Succession.
and succession. Do y'all have those four in your heads now? You need to nod your heads,
Another question from the
one
back.
way or the other. It's a little different, right?
I have a question on, we have these different procedures we could do. Who's going to decide which one process that we're going to go through. Is it going to be the subcommittees? Is it going to be input from you and them, the congregation? What's the procedure just to come to a decision on what path to go?
I could talk some about that. Ultimately, it's not our decision from the conference. We can't tell you to do one or these paths or another. It's just the way the UCC works and the way that it should work, and that I appreciate that it works. Within your congregation, you'll have to figure it out. It sounds as though, from what Mary said, and let me make sure I've got this correct, is that it'll at least start with a conversation among the board. And because these are the options that are there, it'll be up for the board to decide, the council, thank you, the council to decide how to move forward, either with recommendation or getting, there's also going to be more opportunities for feedback that Mary mentioned. So it'll ultimately be up to the council to make the determination how to move forward, and for yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Kelly had a question.
Just a comment. It seems that the method that we choose may depend on the person or the group of people that are out there. Mm-hmm. So sometimes is the ultimate method based on the talent pool. I mean, it's not something that you have to decide we're going to do it this way, and that's the process that we're going to take. Correct?
Yes and no. I have a T-shirt that I sometimes wear to church meetings that say "It depends," because there's a little bit of the "it depends" piece within there. With the interim model, there's a pretty set model and generally a pretty set pool of people that are interims. Most, not all, interims are specifically trained. That tends to be more of a contract, depending on your church, than a calling of the whole church. So that process might be a little bit different. So if you go on that model, that's committing to a particular path. With the other ones, it's more broad than that. I'd say that you should make a general decision, from my perspective, of the primary direction where you intend to head. There have been some times when churches have gotten to a settled process that the candidate has requested it be a designated process because of what they're hearing and because of the conversation that's going on. Or because sometimes the candidate in of themselves was sort of a surprise to the church. That this was the person that they called, not in a negative way, but sort of we didn't think of this person for whatever reason being in this role before. Let's talk about a designated, and that feels fair to everybody too. So it can also be one of those frontier crossing kind of processes. But for the most part, some of the processes that you would use are similar. Again, the interim process is a little bit more limited. So even though it gets shared in UCC employment opportunities, you don't do the full local church profile that you would do. For any of the other ones, you do the full local church profile to be able to move through that process and have that reflective process. And then it'll be up to the church to determine whether or not the person would be a candidate for what would eventually become the settled position or not, within particularly the transitional piece. Does that make more sense, or did it confuse it more?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it's helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, whoops. Sorry. I've got somebody on Zoom who says, I think I get it, but I don't remember what the transitional option was exactly like.
Yeah.
So, maybe
So,
go with it.
and in some ways, the transitional option, the succession model is fairly clear in some ways. The designated model is fairly clear. The interim model is very clear and very specific. Transitional is essentially recognizing that there's other stuff. There's other stuff that a congregation might need to focus on and really work on that might not fit as clearly into one of the other categories. So all these are within the general realm of transition. There's the three that I talked about that are more specifically transitional. Again, the interim, designated, succession model. But there's also this other place where you might need a specific skill or a specific consultant for a specific time within the church's life. And that person may or not, depending on what that thing is that the church needs to work on, be someone who would also be a candidate for a position. So if the transitional one sounds a little vague,
It is.
you've got it right.
Okay.
Mike, would you comment a bit on how the council and the search committee function, what their distinctions are, and how they would work together?
Sure.
Please.
Mary, you might be able to answer this better than I can, because that part of it is a constitution and bylaws piece based on the local church. I'll say generally, and let Mary answer this question, that more specifically, that in some churches, the search committee is called by the congregation and reports directly back to the congregation. In other congregations, the search committee is chosen by the council, and they report back to the council, who then brings a candidate to the church. But I'll let Mary tell you what it is here.
Yes, our bylaws say that the council will choose a search team, and the search team will report back to council. But the search team, as I understand it, and Mike will be helping to guide that search team, will always be in conversation with the whole congregation as we go along. So it won't be like this little hidden team that goes off and thinks about things and then comes back with a solution. We will always be in communication about it. So even though the council will appoint the team, we will take your nominations of the wisest people. We'll be doing that a little later on to be on that team. And we will continue to be in a close relationship with all of you. So I want you to all feel like you're going to be part of this process.
A couple more questions over here.
Karen, and then Barb.
It seems like these different models indicate different times. So like the succession model, it seems like you'd act really quickly to get someone because we have Pastor Andy leaving next August, whereas the interim, you said a year to year and a half. So I was just, maybe speak on that a little bit.
Sure.
About timing.
I'll talk about the succession model first. So with generally how that works is that that does tend to be on a little faster of a timeline, but there's still but your decision should never be based on a timeline alone. At least had some very initial conversations with Andy, and this will be part of the discernment that everyone will have to do together, that in some cases, it's been the instance where the person has stayed a little bit longer, who's the outgoing pastor, in order that they and the pastor that's going to be in succession can have some overlap. So that'll have to be part of the discernment conversation that the board, Andy, and all of you will have together. And again, no pressure on Andy. If Andy just says, nope, that is her right and her calling, and that'll have to be respected along with everything else. But that's generally the way that works out. With the designated, it's sort of the initial contract is recommended to be a year, usually with an update of another 6 months to a year as far as renewing the contract, or that turns into the designated call. With an interim, that's pretty limited to about a year and a half. And the primary reason for that is that there's a recognized difference of the attachment to a pastor, even if they're in the interim role, that happens around that year and a half period, where the church is no longer able to see them in that very interim role. And just for the health of the church, about a year and a half for the interim pastor seems to be about the best. Does that help? Yeah, thank you. Another question over here.
So Mary, my concern is if you're not on a board or committee, you never know what's going on in council. We have no communication of what is happening in the council. So how are you going to address that?
Do you want to use this microphone? Yeah.
You know, we do have communication, but it's too delayed. I mean, I always report what council's doing in our newsletter once a month, and our minutes go up, but they go up a month later after they've been approved. So you're right. It's not enough, is it, Barb? And so I think in this, especially in this period, but maybe we need to forever find a way to be communicating with you all the time. And also, I expect the search committee to be communicating with you at all times. So we'll work on that. Thank you for bringing that up.
And let me just talk briefly about the role of the search committee. They have this role where they're communicating around where they are in process, but there's great confidentiality as far as the candidates that come their way. There's a couple just really clear reasons for that. The most important is that, generally speaking, when a church hears that a pastor is considering leaving, the church starts to say goodbye. They start the process. And sometimes with a pastor, they're really just discerning whether or not they're going to stay in a position or not, or thinking that maybe just that one would be the position that they'd consider, otherwise they want to stay where they are. And so if that process gets going, it can be unhealthy and detrimental to the pastor and the church. So around the specific candidates, until it gets towards the end of the process, there is a great deal of confidentiality for the committee. But as far as where they are in the process and reporting that generally what I suggest to a search committee is that at the point where someone says that they are tired of hearing about the search, they're almost there. Any other questions today? All right. Well, again, thank you for your time. I'm going to be around to have conversations with. Reverend Courtney Stank-Tregear, who's our Minister of Church Vitality, has also done some work with you, is also invested in your congregation, and we'll find some ways to help along the process and along the way too. So we'll be working together with you all. All right, thank you all very much.